הלהבה שבערה בסתרי לבבות, אשרי הבבות שידעו לכדו בכבוד, אשרי הגפור שנשרף והסית להבות.
Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame. Blessed is the flame that burns in the heart's secret places. Blessed is the heart that knows, for honor's sake, to stop its beating. Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame.
76 years ago today, Allied forces liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of 400 Nazi concentration camps. The UN has designated this date as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, 16 years ago. Auschwitz is the symbol of the inhumanity of man, of the mass production of death, yet it is also a call to action in the face of indifference. This is a year that has brought isolation as well as distrust, fear, and anxiety. We have seen a rise of anti-Semitism and racism in our nation and in our borough. White supremacist groups and their propaganda have made inroads in Staten Island and far beyond. We must not be silent, not on anti-Semitism, not on racism or Islamophobia, not on any form of hate. This is a year when we saw how fragile life is. Exactly 1 year ago today, I stood inside the Capitol building with Rami Cohen, who offered the opening prayer to our elected officials in Washington, D.C. We have lost 10 Holocaust survivors from the Staten Island community, including just today, Chaya Sholdes, mother of Jackie Ryder. These are the last generation of eyewitnesses. Who will carry the word to remember the Holocaust and the destruction of democracy and of Jewish life in Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe? We began tonight with the poem Blessed is the Match by Hannah Senesh, whose song captures the courage of this heroine of the Holocaust who resisted fascism strategically and spiritually. She was caught just before her 23rd birthday, killed at the age of the Wagner College students who sang her poetry so beautifully. Bethany Friedman and Ruth Kupperberg are among those who will carry the word. And thanks to those who have donated objects and artifacts, like U.S. Master Sergeant Danny Kravitz, who gave this Jewish star, many thousands of more youth will be educated by the Wagner College and other youth on Staten Island who carry the word. I'm sitting in the Wagner College Holocaust Center, an educational space which has already welcomed hundreds of students from public and Jewish schools to promote an understanding of history. I am proud to say that to consecrate this space, we have recently added a mezuzah on the doorpost, which contains a prayer to affirm the Jewish faith. Created from pieces of broken mirror, it symbolizes tikkun olam, the spiritual obligation to repair the world. It was designed as a one-of-a-kind piece by Rabbi Kerry Olitsky, an artist and educator. We are grateful to community member Audrey Durst, who first proposed acquiring a mezuzah. Who will carry the word? We need each other, our neighbors of all faiths, to repair the world and to commit to respect the memory of 6 million. That is why it is so meaningful to mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day with an interfaith observance. And we need the second and third generation, the children and grandchildren of survivors. I want to thank our co-chairs this evening, Manny Sachs and his daughter Shannon Sachs, for proposing this invitation to Dr. Irit Felsen. Dr. Felsen's talk on those who carry with them the trauma of the Holocaust through generations is a reminder to never forget. A few years ago, I accompanied Chaim Ben Aaron, who passed away this year, to a middle school on Staten Island, PS 49. Chaim, the youngest of 5 brothers, spoke of his beautiful family life before the war tore his family apart. When it ended, he changed his name to honor his father who had passed away, who was murdered, Aaron, and called himself son of Aaron or Ben Aaron. I now call upon Rabbi Mark Ben Aaron, a second-generation survivor, to offer a memorial tribute, which will be followed by remarks by our congressperson.
My name is Rabbi Mark Ben Aaron, son of Chaim Ben Aaron, formerly Chaim Volozhny, from Ostrolenka, Poland. My father was a child, not even a teenager, when the Nazis invaded Poland. Growing up, I was aware that my father was a survivor. I was aware that he was in camps, but he never told his story. I thought it was that he didn't want to talk about his time in the camps. In 6th grade, I had a homework assignment to construct my family tree. I was concerned that I wouldn't be able to get Dad's side of the family. After completing Mom's, she reassured me that Dad would be okay and that there might be parts of his past that he might not share. Many years later, I came to realize that it might have simply been a case of age appropriate. When Dad became the go-to survivor for every high school student in the synagogue. 2 years ago, Shira Stoll was interviewing survivors on Staten Island. She asked me what it was like growing up the child of a survivor. I said that for my classmates, the Holocaust was simply a paragraph within one chapter of a world history textbook. However, for me, it shaped who I would become. Unfortunately, he passed away this past December. Tonight, I light a candle in his honor and in the memory of the Volozhny family who perished in the Shoah.
Hello everyone, my name is Julia Loria and I'm a Wagner College alumni, and during my time at Wagner I had the honor and pleasure of working with Lori at the Holocaust Center along with many Holocaust survivors who took the time to share their stories. And I'm also a Holocaust survivor's granddaughter. My grandfather had survived the Holocaust. He was from Berlin, and during the night of the broken glass, that's when his parents thought it'd be safer for him to take the train and to meet his sister in France. Unfortunately, his parents thought that they would be safe there, but that was the last time he saw his parents. I'm here today to light a candle with the help of my sister Paula. Tonight we light up this candle to remember the Holocaust survivors, the people who passed away during the Holocaust, and it's important for us never to forget, for history never to repeat itself.
Hi, it's Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis in Washington, D.C. As a proud Wagner College graduate, it's an honor to welcome you to this particular program. And particularly, I want to thank Dr. Irit Felsen for hosting tonight's event and addressing the group and allowing us to talk about some of the trauma experienced by the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. As somebody who visited Israel recently and attended the Yad Vashem Memorial, it was something that was incredibly eye-opening. It was something that I believe everyone should experience, that memorial, to truly understand the atrocities of the Holocaust. So we never forget, always remember this part of our world history, as horrible as it is. Thank you very much for participating in tonight's event, and I hope you'll share what is discussed tonight with many others so we can make sure that future generations know exactly what occurred in those horrible years and make sure that it never repeats itself ever in our world.
Good evening, peace and blessings, shalom.
Shalom.
This is Imam Tahir. It's an honor and privilege to be among this very important group of leaders of our community. I'm Albanian, Muslim, and I'm proud to be part of this important group of ours that leads to increasing the awareness of proud moments of our common history between Jewish and Albanians throughout the history, but also to increase awareness of the elements that they were threatening Jewish lives those days, and those are targets are the same. So Albanians during the World War II, they were the only nation in Europe that they have saved and protected Jewish people. Not one single life of Jewish community was lost. The only country in Europe that Jews, they were more in numbers after the war, that was Jews of Albania. And for those they don't know, the Jewish philosopher and the mind that we all as a humanity take big proud of him was Albert Einstein, the Jewish philosopher. He came to this great country of ours in America with Albanian passport. So we remember the Besa, we remember the heroic act of Albanian people. Always when the Holocaust is mentioned, we do remember that Albanians, they had a great deal in saving human lives, and in this case, the Jewish lives. And why Jews, they have to remember, and they have to always tell the story of Holocaust to Jewish people, but others, because history that is being forgotten, unfortunately, is doomed to be repeated. And hope and pray that this history will never be repeated again. But there are so many lessons in the Jewish heroism and bravery during the Second World War. There's so many people that they have shown so much heroism that this story needs to be told. And what is the better platform than having Muslims, Jews, Christians, and other people of faith like we are here in Staten Island? We do thank very much Dr. Lori for her leadership, that we have been in this together since 2001. I know her. That was November 7, 2001. We did the program at the Wagner College, Rabbi Meets Imam. And that was coordinated by Dr. Lori. And the program was led by Rabbi David Katz and Imam Tahir that is speaking. And once again, I'm honored to be here. And on behalf of the Albanian Islamic Center, an Albanian community, a Muslim community, we express the support for Jewish community, and which we stand together. As previously mentioned by Dr. Lori, we see these, haters, hate mongers that are still out there, but as long as we stand firm together, they have no place to spread the hate. God bless you all.
Thank you, Imam Tahir, for 2 decades of work and for your commitment to fight hate and strengthen our community, and for bringing attention to the 25,000 righteous Gentiles who helped rescue Jews in the Holocaust. I also want to thank the interreligious clergy, the Communities United in Respect and Trust, B'nai Jeshurun, and the Council of Jewish Organizations of Staten Island for co-sponsoring this interfaith and bipartisan event. We must take the time to honor the millions of victims of genocide, persecution, and ethnic cleansing, both in World War II and after, in order to cultivate empathy and respect in future generations so that these atrocities may never happen again. We now launch our conversation on intergenerational trauma with the reflections of our event co-chairs, Manny Sachs and Shannon Sachs. Manny's father survived Buchenwald, a site of forced labor and inhumane experiments. His mother survived Bergen-Belsen, a severely overcrowded camp. When its liberators entered, they found over 13,000 corpses in need of burial. During his 4 decades of communal involvement, Manny Sachs is most proud of his work for Holocaust education. He was founder and chair of the Staten Island Holocaust Commemoration Committee, a president of 2 local synagogues, chair of UJA breakfasts and Israeli bond drives, and a member of the Wagner College Phi Society and ongoing member of the Wagner College Advisory Committee. His daughter Shannon is on the board of 3GNY, an organization of third-generation survivors. I hope you will listen carefully to their words, which introduce the concepts discussed by Dr. Felsen.
I never had the opportunity to meet my grandfather Samuel, or Shmuel, his given name, and for whom I'm named. He passed away before I was born, but from what I've been told by those who knew him, he was a caring and compassionate man, a real mensch, and he possessed a gutta neshama, a good soul, a good spirit. The same holds true for my grandma Manya, of blessed memory, who I was thankful to have had in my life up until the time I was in law school. Growing up a 3G, or third generation Holocaust survivor, has placed an indelible mark in my mind, in my heart, and in my soul. While growing up, I quickly learned the 3 main tenets or key moral principles of Judaism: chesed, acts of loving kindness, or more simply, caring for someone; tzedakah, the giving of charity; and tzedek, justice. I've tried to live my life by these 3 basic Jewish principles, knowing that my grandparents, even during all the horrors of the Holocaust and during their darkest days, kept true to themselves and their belief in Judaism. Even after everything my grandparents endured, they remained kind, compassionate people and were always ready, willing, and able to help others in need. They opened a candy store and luncheonette in Brooklyn. I've been told many stories of how people would come to the shop and they wouldn't have enough money to buy food or pay their tab. And my grandparents put them at ease and were more than willing to help them out and cover their tab or give them food. They never wanted to see anyone go hungry. Although my grandparents are no longer with us, their attributes have clearly been passed down to my father, who in turn has passed them down to me. From volunteering at soup kitchens throughout my life to participating in New York Cares volunteering efforts across New York City to interning at the Special Victims Bureau at the Richmond County DA's office in law school, or being a board member of 3GNY, I've always tried to give of myself to help others, just as my grandparents did and just as my father continues to do. To that end, I can easily see how the traumas of my grandparents' past may have heavily influenced my father's upbringing and subsequently mine. While the study of intergenerational or historical trauma is really in its infancy, knowing what I know about my grandparents' Holocaust experiences, their post-war life, and the fact that they were not avid sharers of their Holocaust stories, I can see the emotional and psychological effect it has had on my father. My father's life was clearly shaped by his parents' history, experiences, and devotion to Hashem, even in the face of adversity. From my perspective, I've observed my father continuously try to make sense of it all, of the Holocaust, of my grandparents' lives. There's just so much information we don't know that he just tries to find out and piece together. He has a never-ending drive and an overabundance of passion for it. That being said, my father and I took a trip to Poland several years ago to trace our family's roots and to explore our past and where we came from. We traveled to both of my grandparents' hometowns of Sosnowiec and Będzin and searched the nearby graveyards in search of my great-grandfather's tombstone, for which my father was named. Our father-daughter exploration of our Jewish heritage and attempts to walk in our family's footsteps left me with chills. I know my father always wonders how different his life would have been if there was no Holocaust, if he grew up in Europe, and if he knew his extended family, and if he was able to experience their impact on his life. It's a never-ending question that always lingers in his mind and unfortunately will never be properly answered.
I'm deeply humbled, and it's with great humility that I speak with you tonight as a 2G, a child of Holocaust survivors. It took a tour of duty in Vietnam and new friendships returning from Vietnam with Vietnam veterans who are plagued with post-traumatic stress to begin to try and understand my parents' Holocaust trauma. Growing up as a 2G, I experienced firsthand my parents' traumatic stress, but they never spoke about it. I obviously knew that Mom was from Sosnowitz and my dad from Bendin, both in Poland. I knew that my dad served in the Polish 122nd Light Artillery Brigade, and I knew my mom was liberated from Bergen-Belsen and my dad from Buchenwald. But they spoke very little to me about what they experienced after being taken from their homes and placed in multiple concentration camps. During the Holocaust, my parents were abused, beaten, humiliated, degraded. They were haunted by those who perished. They painfully lamented about their parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, and many friends that did not survive. My mom and dad never discussed their post-traumatic stress with me or my sister, but as a child, I always felt it in my heart. I observed it, and then there was nothing I felt I could really do about it. On weekends, they schlepped us to social gatherings with friends. While our parents discussed the horrific personal experiences amongst themselves, the Kinderlach, the children, played. While we played, we heard them speak in Mamelush, in Yiddish, or sometimes in Polish if they didn't want us to understand. However, after time, it became evident that these conversations were parts of a larger puzzle. Yet many of us never asked our parents about these conversations, though we should have. We were most likely afraid to ask for fear of hurting or insulting them. If Mom and Dad sensed my interest, they quickly retorted, "Frag nicht kein Kasches, don't ask any questions." In later years, my mom, more than my dad, opened up, but only a little. My dad would be eligible for an Academy Award for Stoicism. He was mum for as long as I knew him. Mom got upset with me for taking our synagogue's Holocaust Torah for a presentation for a discussion of the Holocaust with the history students at Tottenville High School. Why do you want to talk to them about our pain and our experiences in the concentration camps? Why? She thought that the students should not know from the horrors. In my response, I told my mom that it was important to educate the students and to remind them never to forget. After arriving in the United States, we found refuge in the neighborhood with a lot of Holocaust survivors. A few years after arriving, my sister Susan was born. She was named for my father's mother of blessed memory. I took advantage of the opportunities provided and became involved in a variety of activities. In due course, the famous draft notice arrived. I had a few options: leave the United States and begin a new life in Israel and/or in Canada with family, attend rabbinical school and obtain a draft deferment, or serve my country. I opted for the latter. The United States of America provided our family with an opportunity to rebuild our lives from the ashes of the Churban, the destruction of European Jewry. I owed a debt of gratitude to the United States. My country called upon me, and I answered the call. My Jewish education served me well, especially in Vietnam. In addition to the responsibilities within my unit, I also organized Shabbat services and a range of both Jewish and ecumenical programs. I also assisted in the organizing of Passover Seder in Saigon. It is so unfortunate that our homecoming was marred by protests and insults. But after meeting and falling in love and getting married to my amazing wife, Karen, my life began anew. Karen gave birth to our wonderful daughter, Shannon, who was named for my father of blessed memory. I'm happy that my mother was able to shep nachas in her lifetime. Shannon personifies the Jewish values, ideals, character traits of being a mensch. At some time in her lifetime, she will become an Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor. Finally, during the past 40 years of living on Staten Island, I've been privileged to volunteer on behalf of both the Jewish and Staten Island communities at large. Hopefully, I made a bit of a difference. I'm grateful to my parents for having shaped my life. And in closing, in memory of those consumed by the Holocaust, may their memory be for a blessing and a warning. Let us remember and not forget.
We thank Manny and Shannon Sachs for their work as co-chairs of tonight's event. and Manny's ongoing dedication to Wagner College Holocaust Center. I have the honor to work alongside Manny on High Society with the leadership of Dr. Victor and Kim Avis for almost a decade. In this cultural and political climate, it's especially important that we take time today to recommit to the fight against anti-Semitism, including efforts to root out Holocaust denial, educate others about all issues related to the Holocaust and genocide. My name is Ruta Shaw Gordon, and I serve as the Vice President of Internationalization, Intercultural Affairs, and Campus Life here at the college. I oversee the work of Hillel at Wagner and other faith and social justice groups, and have watched as the Holocaust Center's work has deepened over the past decade to help us address issues of prejudice and anti-Semitism, and educate not only our students, but those on Staten Island, the other boroughs of New York City, and in New Jersey, all under the competent and passionate leadership of Dr. Lori Weintraub. On behalf of President Joel Martin and the entire Wagner College community, I would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Irit Felsen. Dr. Felsen has dedicated her life to understanding anxiety and post-traumatic reactions in survivors of mass trauma and traumatic loss. She has been able to listen to and help hundreds of Holocaust survivors and their descendants, offering them care, support, and guidance over the years. Beyond her work in private practice, she currently serves as a member of the Yale University Genocide Trauma Research Group and is an adjunct professor at Ferkauf Graduate School of Psychology at Yeshiva University. Dr. Felsen's talk today will be in two parts. First, Dr. Felsen will introduce us to the particular strengths and challenges that come with surviving the Holocaust and genocide. Then she will address questions from audience members regarding the current political climate in America. You're encouraged at that point to add questions into the chat. Dr. Felsen's talk will offer new insights into our age of anxiety when the witnesses to the Shoah will soon be no longer with us. Her words offer us a guide and hope from her studies of intergenerational trauma. We thank her for joining us tonight. Dr. Felsen.
Thank you very much. I am very honored to be part of this group. Thank you, Imam Tahir, for joining us, and thank you for your people's bravery. I will share the screen now, and hopefully all will work. So, I start these days every talk I give with the only single photo that I have of my ancestors. This is the photograph of my father's family before the war, just before the war, sent out to a relative that left. That's the only one I have of his family, and there was none left of my mother's family, which caused my mother great pain over her loss of any image of the people she loved. So based on the findings over the last few decades of research in Holocaust families, we have now come to understand that the trauma that occurs in one generation can actually reverberate in generations of descendants of survivors, not even just their children. The presence of the past is an expression coined by Bowen, who is considered the father of family therapy, or the telescoping of generations, as it was put by Feinberg, speaks about the transmission of powerful themes and relational patterns in families down future generations. And when it comes to the transmission of themes and patterns associated with trauma, my colleagues from Israel, Dov Shmotkin and his colleagues said it beautifully. It would seem that following a massive trauma like the Holocaust, the lifetime of one generation is not sufficient to bridge between the world of trauma and the world of normal life. So very late, only in 2014, we have actually come to see the formal recognition of the concept of transmission of historical trauma. And we have seen it by now in research in many populations that were exposed to mass trauma, whether it's Native Americans, Armenians, survivors of the Armenian genocide, American Japanese who were interned in here in the Second World War, survivors of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, Bosnian refugees, Rwandan refugees, and unfortunately many, many others since then. This is one visual representation that I wanted to share with you, which is a graph that shows the two pillars in the center are the post-traumatic stress symptoms observed in survivors of the Holocaust in a meta-analytic study that included more than 70 studies in 2010. So 60 years or so after the end of their trauma, this is the level of post-traumatic stress symptoms that survivors who are either completely community dwelling and never had any kind of mental health services, or those in the darker pillar who had some mental health services. This is the level of symptoms, of post-traumatic symptoms they still showed, which tells you what kind of levels of symptoms their children observed in them while they were younger, 30 and 40 years earlier, and raising their children. So what does it mean to live with a spouse or a parent who suffers from post-traumatic stress symptoms? We call it, as Charles Figley coined the term, secondary traumatization. And he stated it beautifully, saying, simply being a member of a family and caring deeply about its members makes us emotionally vulnerable to the catastrophes that impact them. And it impacts children or spouses through close continued contact, which is itself a chronic stressor that leads to identification and what we call empathic distress as we hear and learn about the imagery and the stories of what the survivor went through, or as we see directly their suffering, even if they are silent, and through the impaired functioning of the traumatized person in some of the facets of their functioning as a spouse or as a parent. I speak of a concept that I coined dual reality of trauma. It's very similar to the concept of post-memory by Mariana Hirsch. And my very close friend and mentor, Dori Lau, who was himself a child survivor of the Holocaust and a very esteemed researcher in the field of intergenerational transmission, put it this way. He said, children of survivors of the Holocaust view the world from a vantage point of a catastrophe that ravaged their family. And this knowledge of the catastrophe that happened is not an informational knowledge. It's not about the historical facts. In fact, many of us have a very hard time keeping an orderly story in our mind of the effects of our parents' lives. The fragments that we collect are disorganized and the timeline is broken up and messed up. The knowledge of the Holocaust for children of survivors is paradoxically an experiential knowledge of an event that happened before we were born. And that knowledge, that experiential knowledge, is mediated through the emotional relationship with the parents in both implicit and explicit ways. This is a beautiful picture that I wanted to share with you, one of a series of photographs that Shimon Ati created in a project called Writing on the Wall, where he found old photographs of Jewish life and projected them life-size on old buildings and in Europe. And so it's a beautiful depiction of what post-memory or dual reality is, because we have not seen this man, we have not seen him in his life doing this, and yet we do see him there in this real and not real, concrete and ephemeral way that memory plays in transmission of trauma. And what do I mean by the dual reality? I mean that for children of survivors, there are two different sets of realities. There is the reality of the here and now in the safe places where we were born, America, Israel, the United, Canada, Australia, after the war, and the rules of engagement with the others in this normal, relatively safe reality. And there's the trauma reality, where inconceivably sadistic, horrible things happen, and where everybody can be a perpetrator, and where the behavior of the self is dictated by the mere need to survive and not by social desirability and how to be nice and give your turn to the other person first. So I would like you to think of it, of those two dual realities, as separated by a glass floor. A reality of trauma which lies underneath the glass floor with all of its horrific images and memories and fragments of stories that we know. And above it, we live in the current reality of the here and now, our safe lives, the way that we're supposed to behave like nice, good citizens and good people. Why do I say glass floor? Because I want to indicate that the separation is transparent, and that just like if it were a glass floor, we would see the horrific images of the trauma underneath, somewhere in the periphery of our visual field. In the same way, the reality of trauma exists in the periphery of the psychological world of children of survivors at all times. And there is a dynamic relationship of background and foreground between the reality of the trauma and the reality of the here and now. And the reality of the trauma can rush forward and even overwhelm our emotional reaction, depending on various triggers, inner triggers, internal triggers, interpersonal triggers, such as some anti-Semitic sounding comment, social, political triggers that remind us of the Holocaust can make us have a reaction that is from the trauma reality that can overwhelm what we see in the future, in the present. This is an example of the dual reality and the emotional reaction to it. This is simply a photograph taken by a close friend of grapevines in the snow in Austria. When I show this picture on a large screen to a room full of children of survivors, you can often hear an audible gasp, because to us children of survivors, this very concrete and simple picture reminds us of emaciated Holocaust survivors, inmates of a concentration camp, standing in rows in the concentration camp in the morning in the roll call in the morning. And our reaction is completely as if that's what we were seeing. So imagine if that's our reaction to a concrete photograph, how much more we are likely to have emotional reactions that are dictated by the trauma reality to much more complicated and complex stimuli, such as interpersonal comments, social and political events, and so forth. So how are these trauma experiences of our parents communicated to the second generation to become an experiential knowledge? They are mediated, as most of the most important stuff is mediated between parents and infants through facial expressions, gestures, gaze, vocal qualities, and bodily movements. And if you haven't seen on YouTube a piece of what we call the still face experiment, I strongly recommend that you go and see it and see how an infant who's only a few months old, how strongly they respond to changes in these aspects of the interaction with the parent. And the experiment essentially comes to show how powerful is the impact of a moment in which a depressed mother or a mother who has PTSD is sort of off in her own world, and how sensitive infants are to it. Of course, for children of trauma survivor parents, that kind of a moment happens repeatedly and has a great cumulative influence. As the child is older, the communication of trauma occurs through many, many relational, what we call micro interactions in family life, in daily interactions. And if we had time, I would explain to you some of these examples that are so replete in the illustrated novel Mouse, or in a similarly illustrated novel by the Belgian-born Israeli cartoonist Michel Kishka. His novel is titled Second Generation, Things I Didn't Tell My Father. And we can talk a little bit more about it, perhaps if somebody wants to ask about it later. So in my review of the early findings on the second generation, I concluded that there were no psychopathological disorders seen in the second generation as a group. What we did see was an indication for some higher level of psychological disorders when second generation were very young and still living at home, but no longer when they were older and have left their parents' homes. What we also saw was a whole host of elevated scores in areas such as anxiety, the tendency towards depressive experiences, guilt, hypervigilance, interpersonal sensitivities, feelings of alienation, over and under control of aggression, self-criticism, many scores that were statistically significantly higher than the scores of our peers, but they still remained within normative range. They did not reach clinical significance. Now, based on those studies, we already know now in the recent few decades, couple of decades, based on studies in families of Holocaust survivors, there's many other research that was done on other children of trauma survivors. And in a very good recent meta-analytic study that was conducted on children of more than 4,000 parents, we see that there is at least twice likelihood of depressive and anxiety symptoms in the children of parents who survived trauma and developed post-traumatic stress disorder in comparison to the children of parents who went through the same trauma and did not develop post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms that stayed with them for a long time. So the critical element is not only whether parents went through trauma, but to which extent they continue to suffer from post-traumatic symptoms for decades after. Now, it's very important to also emphasize that the extent of traumatic transmission to the second generation is very, very much higher in the children of people who suffered interpersonal trauma, such as persecution, such as the Holocaust, in comparison to other traumas that are very severe, such as natural disasters or technological disasters, but they are not interpersonal. They don't have that added element of malignant intent to harm and to hurt and to kill. What we see in many children of survivors of different populations is beautifully stated here by the group that was led by Field and studied the children of survivors of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And they put it this way, they said, parents who continue to be psychologically affected by past trauma, such as the trauma stemming from genocide, may communicate, even if indirectly, their emotional vulnerability to their children and thereby instill inordinate concern in the children for the parents' welfare. So what we see in children of survivors is the development of certain missions and expectations that differ from what is usual for the relationship between parents and children. And these unusual missions, on one hand, created burdens in the lives of children of survivors because they prevented them oftentimes from doing the same things that their peers were doing. One of the things that were most difficult about those special missions that we felt as the second generation was that we somehow felt that we need to make our parents happy to make up for the terrible sufferings that they went through, to make up for their terrible losses. But it was really, in many cases, an impossible task. And so oftentimes, the failure at doing it well enough, at making the parents happier, was perceived by second generation as reflecting their own failure rather than the impossibility of the task. So speaking about those strengths and skills that these missions did lead us to develop, sometimes prematurely, sometimes at a great cost, of course, as everything does have a cost in life. but those strengths that we developed are very unique in the sense that they are double-edged traits, as I call them. So unlike some cases where we can talk about a certain personality organization, such as, let's say, the typical or prototypical schizoid personality, we can talk about strengths in certain areas, such as their attention to detail, their intellectual capacity, all of those things, you know, the typical nerd, if you like, the typical technological genius. And at the same time, they might have incredibly deficient abilities in very separate domains of social and interpersonal skills. In the children and grandchildren of survivors, but I'll focus right now on the 2G, the strengths and the vulnerabilities are actually one and the same thing. They are more like the two sides of the same coin. The same trait can be both simultaneously an asset and a liability, depending on the rigidity or the overdetermined use of that trait. So, for example, I'll just rattle off a couple of them. One of the strengths that many of us share is actually a precious perspective on life, just because of our very personal sort of understanding of the fragility of life. And it's very much consistent with our concept of what is post-traumatic growth, which is something that people that came out of terrible situations, such as the Holocaust, such as POWs, such as Vietnam veterans, as Manny mentioned, a certain understanding of the preciousness of life that is actually the result of being so close to these terrible situations and to the loss of life. Preparedness for disaster is something that many of us share. We are always alert and prepared for all kinds of possible negative events, negative turns. Things can be a lot worse. If something's going wrong, we expect the worst, but we are very well prepared. We have tremendous resources to deal with these things, but that preparedness that's always there, that hypervigilance, its cost is a chronic state of certain elevated anxiety and worry. And that can detract from the capacity to relax, to be carefree. It also can be annoying for people who are with us and want us to just relax and be carefree at times that are non-stressful and don't call for that kind of preparedness and hypervigilance. We have a good sense of a good deal of our parents' hardening and self-denial. Our parents had to be able to endure a lot, to ignore their pain, to ignore their fatigue. They didn't sleep well at night because they had post-traumatic stress disorders. They slept poorly, they had nightmares. They were tired, but they were able to get up in the morning and to go to work. And sometimes they worked more than one job. That level of hardening requires a certain capacity to ignore and repress your own pain, fatigue, discomfort. It's of course a strength in many ways. It is also something that can be very detrimental to one's health. And I can talk more about what we see in the second generation as we reach middle age that we think is related to that. It can also be something that we then expect others to do, to have the same hardening, the same level of endurance, which can make us seem unempathic in some ways or too demanding to other people. We are very resourceful, as I said, very tenacious. We can make the best of, we can try to make the best of anything, whether it's a broken object or a very difficult relationship or a difficult boss. And at times, it's of course a great resource. And at times we actually need to know when to let go of something rather than to try make it work. Again, whether it's a job or a partner or a relationship that actually we can leave, but we have a hard time doing it because we have learned from our relationship with parents to do that, to try and make it work, to be responsible for the synchronicity in the relationship. And children cannot leave their parents whom they love. So it's a pattern that we take with us and import to later relationship in life. There are a few other things that we could talk about, but perhaps because we lost a couple of minutes, I will skip a few of the other unique and specific strengths that are born out of the relationship with survivor parents, and tell you that in a very recent couple of studies that I did, empirical studies with children of survivors and their responses to the pandemic, we definitely see, as part of what I just told you, we see an overarching sense of hypervigilance and anxiety that was related to the events around the pandemic, the sharp rise in gun sales, the fears of what people might do when there's scarcity in the stores, there's not enough stuff for everybody, the political issues, the anti-Semitism, the racism, the violence, those were extremely worrisome for children of survivors and for third generation as well. Sort of consistent with other findings that we have from other situations that show the children of survivors have a tendency to carry with them, as part of that dual reality that I spoke about, a certain hostile worldview, a sensitivity to expect hostilities from the world. And at the same time, I also found in my research evidence for that resilient aspect of that hypervigilance. Many of them spoke about, one of them said, I was the canary in the mine. I'm always the canary in the mine. And she talked about how early on, even before we were all asked to wear masks and maintain social distance, she was telling her boss that this is really dangerous, that people should put their masks on, people should be much more serious about it. And everybody else was saying, you're just an alarmist, you're overdoing it. And she said, yes, I'm always the canary in the mine. I always notice the signs of danger and I try to warn everybody else, but at the same time, it's oftentimes very upsetting for other people. So there was a lot of resilience and also a lot of, before that, I'll go back, a lot of hardiness that people also spoke about. The hardiness and the sense that this is not the Holocaust, we can get through it. This is nothing in comparison to what our parents went through. And a sense of being prepared, having been prepared and having been ready to deal with the difficulties that this situation created, whether it is having to stay at home or doing without some of the things that we like doing. We can do it. This is a lot less than what our parents lived through. So what I wanted to tell you is also that it's very clear when you, in this study, as well as in other studies that dealt with the second and the third generation, many times the responses of the second and the third generation are attributed. They attribute their greater sense of efficacy, competence, resilience to their grandparents or parents or grandparents' experiences in the Holocaust. And it's very consistent with what we understand post-traumatic growth to be, which is not only that appreciation of life and the ability to be much clearer about what one's priorities are in life, but also a recognition of one's strengths, one's own strengths and endurance that is born out of having gone through such very difficult experiences. And what we see, therefore, is that resilience and post-traumatic growth can also be transmitted down generations and can not only impact populations and groups as the transmission of trauma and effects related to the trauma, but also self-efficacy and resilience and post-traumatic growth can also be transmitted into families and in groups. And so I will conclude by saying that resilience and post-traumatic growth are also transmitted down the generation of Holocaust survivor families and other populations that were exposed to mass trauma. Resilience, in the most concise way that I can summarize it, having really been steeped in research about it, is the conscious decision to move forward despite the trauma, despite the post-traumatic symptoms that we continue to suffer from, but the conscious decision to move forward, to build ahead, not to be bogged down by what happened, but to be focused on the future and on building. Post-traumatic growth, as I mentioned, is often experienced as this heightened appreciation of life, a heightened appreciation of relationships with others, seeing new possibilities in life, a sense of one's own strength, and for many people, a feeling of spiritual change. So I would like to just remind you of the beautiful way in which this young woman, Amanda Gorman, put it in some of the lines of what she said. You know, her focus on the conscious decision to move forward and to do it together. If we merge mercy with might, she said, and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Felsen, for this powerful and pertinent presentation. It certainly resonated with me as a 3G. My name is Rabbi Sam Castell, and I'm the Rabbi of Congregation B'nai Jeshurun and one of the co-sponsors tonight. You mentioned hypervigilance as a reaction to the trauma in general. I saw one of your YouTube videos of one of your talks in which you talked about the sense that you as a second-generation survivor need to stock up on food, even though the reality doesn't always warrant it. I relate to that sense of scarcity even when it seems unnecessary. That fear of not having enough food has especially kicked up for me and for a lot of people during the pandemic. I realize that it may be related to the malnutrition that my mother experienced in the Shanghai ghetto and her severe anxiety that we experienced. The other area that I wonder about is the idea that we can't trust non-Jews because they will inevitably turn against us. This was a message that, whether overtly said or not, I got. I wonder where the healthy balance is between prudent vigilance to real anti-Semitism and being stuck in the past and missing genuine friendship shown to us by many non-Jews.
Well, you know, some of the examples that we grow up with about betrayal are beyond horrific. It's the betrayal of, my father was saved by a man who was betrayed by his own brother and given to the Gestapo by his own brother. Religious figures. I have horrific examples of people telling me of horrifically terrible things that were done by religious figures. So we have in this dual reality that I speak about, we have this deep cellular mistrust on some level. We know we don't trust until trust is broken. We trust in a very superficial way until trust is proven that that the person is worthy of trust. Yes. At the same time, I think it's extremely helpful to remember that even under the most horrific circumstances, there were people like the Imam spoke about. There were people like the man who saved my father. There were people who showed not only, on one hand, the Holocaust really brought to the fore the worst about human beings, and also the most noble and amazing, and not necessarily from people who are only highly educated or set in some very comfortable positions to do it. Some very, very varied people are amongst those tzaddikim, those virtuous people who did that. And I think we have to keep that in mind as well. And remember that it's important for us to focus on the helpers. As Mr. Rogers said, his mother always told him, focus on the helpers. because that's what's going to make the world better, and that's what's going to make us better.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Felsen. I've got two questions for you because one came up during your fascinating discussion, and one we prepared before. You recently hosted a symposium with descendants of Native Americans and African Americans in relation to intergenerational trauma. What do you feel are the greatest similarities and differences between those groups and Holocaust survivors and their descendants? And is it similar or dissimilar to descendants of the Rwandan or Bosnian genocides? Okay, that's a mouthful, I know.
Well, no, actually, I was going to say, this is not a mouthful. This is enough for a seminar. Certainly for a separate lecture, because there are many, many differences and we cannot smear them away. There are incredibly important differences between someone who's the descendant of 3 or 4 or 5 generations of slaves and someone who is like my parents. You know, I'm first generation. They did not grow up slaves. They did not grow up, you know, they had a great, good life before, and then they were enslaved in the Holocaust. So there are many, many very, very important differences, and we have to respect those differences and study them in great detail. At the same time, there are some incredibly powerful and very, very important similarities. The first of them being something that today may sound so obvious to us, that there is such a thing as intergenerational transmission of trauma. It took several decades for that to be acknowledged. And mind you, until today, the debate continues. And there are researchers who still claim that it actually isn't so, at least in families of Holocaust survivors. I will tell you just one thing. One of those researchers, whom I greatly respect, by the way, yes, but you have to understand that we are all now very much aware of our own contextuality and how we do research and what questions we ask and which instruments we use are not totally objective. And there are many ways of looking at the complex realities in social sciences. And so this, one of the researchers who says that they did not see evidence for transmission in Holocaust families down to the second and third generation is the same man who also said in a seminar we shared that every night of his life for decades, he would call his mother, his survivor mother, at 12 o'clock at night so that she will be able to go to sleep peacefully. Now, that is intergenerational transmission of trauma. And those elements that have to do with a very different parent-child relationship, with a very different sense of responsibility that the child bears in the relationship with the parents who are perceived as people who suffered so much. And also some of the impaired functioning of some post-traumatic parents. Those things are similar in all populations where people suffered massive trauma.
And then my next question, a lot of the effects of trauma that you mentioned, resourcefulness, tenacity, empathy, preparedness, respect for the precious lives that we have, they don't feel like weaknesses. I know you said they're strengths. So is all trauma bad trauma, or can this be the good that comes from the bad, or the proverbial rainbow after the rainstorm?
Well, so you're helping me highlight this very, very important point that I wanted to highlight, that the kind of transmission in second generation and third generation are these two-sided traits that can be a liability and can be a strength depending on, I mean, if you're going to be hyper vigilant and prepared for disaster all the time, then some of the time when there's a good reason, it will be useful. The rest of the time, it will be a pain in the neck, right? there are, and this is what I try to show about many of these traits. And yes, I also want to highlight the fact that out of trauma comes also resilience and comes also post-traumatic growth in many populations. From the same place of the wound comes also a lot of strength, and we need to listen to each other's stories and to give room for the wound and for the resilience to express itself.
Thank you so very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hi, I think I'm next. I'm Susan Loeb. I'm a second generation survivor. My father survived Auschwitz and my mother was in the ghetto in Budapest. So much of what you said resonated with me, and I thank you so much for your presentation. One of the things you made me think about was that idea of triggers. And when I first moved to Staten Island, I grew up in Brooklyn, but when I first moved to Staten Island, I had an experience of seeing everybody running for the ferry with the doors closing. And there was something about the way those doors were closing that just made me think of cattle car. And I literally froze while everybody was running. There was just something about it that totally freaked me out. And you know, it's just amazing to me because obviously that was not my personal experience. But so I was going to ask you some other questions, but I feel like you answered them. But one of the things that you did make me think about was I would love you to talk a little bit about the difference between parents who spoke about their experiences and the effect that had on children versus not speaking about it. My father didn't want to speak about it because he felt, you know, it was a way to protect me and to spare my brother and I. And yet for me, I went to Yeshiva in Borough Park where all the teachers were survivors and had numbers on their arms and talked about it. And so I thought that if my father wasn't talking about it, it meant it was unspeakable. So in fact, I imagined it even worse than what it was because, so I feel like for me, it actually was worse that he didn't speak about it, that once he finally started speaking about it, it actually felt more manageable. So anyway, if you could respond to what do you see any differences?
Yeah, so I think that it's become quite clear that, again, not only in Holocaust families, but certainly also in Holocaust families, that for the most part, those who didn't speak, there was, and many, I think, also said that his father never spoke and his mother did not want him to speak. You know, we talk about the double wall. The parents didn't want to speak because they wanted to protect their children. The children didn't want to ask because they wanted to protect their parents. And there is a beautiful poem by second generation Janice Freebaum poet that speaks about it. And I'll be happy to share it with you afterwards. It's beautifully addressing that point of speaking or not speaking. So the double wall was that wall of silence that protected, so to speak, the two generations. And what I think we have come to see quite clearly in terms of empirical research, not only clinical observations, is that it doesn't work well because it was really maintained mostly by parents who did not feel that they were able to metabolize their experiences well enough to speak about it to the children at a level that was age appropriate and that was measured relative to the child's level of interest at any given time. So you had parents who spoke about it all the time, excessively, also in ways that were not appropriate and not in the right at the right level of the child's developmental level or the child's level of interest at a given moment. Children who tell me it was their breakfast, lunch, and dinner, it was there all the time. or the parents who didn't speak at all. In both cases, these extreme ways show you the lack of ability of the survivor parent to metabolize it in a way that allowed a different and more modulated, more appropriate way of talking about it to the children, so that the children will have a possibility of metabolizing it as well. And those two extremes, whether talking excessively and inappropriately relative to the child's development, or not talking at all, seems to be not helpful for the child in the child's attempt to metabolize all that stuff that is anyway there. Implicitly, parents cannot protect the children from that. So it's there. And if the parent cannot help the child make sense of it to some extent, then essentially the child is left to their own means to deal with that. And that's not very good.
Thank you so much.
Okay, hi, my name is Dan Glassman. I'm a 3G survivor. My grandmother was a survivor, and this actually explains a lot of her behavior when I lived with my grandmother in our house, where I experienced. We do have a question in the chats that from Isabella. Do the psychophysical effects of trauma generally lessen from one generation to the next, or do they remain as strong? Can these symptoms and pathologies increase from one generation to the next?
So yes, so this question has a few different elements in it. It includes, actually, it alludes to the issue of epigenetics, right? So yes, we do know now, we have this whole new field of epigenetics that speaks about actual physiological changes in the expression of the DNA in descendants of people who suffered prolonged traumatic experiences. We do know that that happens, and that is part of the transmission of trauma. The transmission of trauma has many, many mechanisms and many manifestations that include these physiological changes. And as I said before, when I was speaking, I said I might touch upon it. We see in second generation, as they reach middle age, or since we have reached middle age, we see that we have more medical conditions and certain problems, physiological medical problems, than our non-Holocaust related peers. We have a greater tendency to show, high cholesterol and pre-diabetic conditions, which may be related to those changes that our parents suffered starvation, and the epigenetic changes that were transmitted to us were supposed to prepare us for an environment in which we will starve as well. But since, thank God, we are living in an environment that we don't starve in, it creates these conditions in us. So yes, transmission involves physiological, psychological, relational mechanisms that create these differences. And yes, so that's the first part of the question. And the other part is, yes, we do see an effect of dilution, in the sense that if the second generation had one survivor parent and one non-survivor parent, the effects of the transmission seem to be lesser. And if the third generation has two parents who are 2G, the effects are, as opposed to one parent who's 2G, one parent 2G, less effects in the third generation. So there is a certain dilution. At the same time, there is a curious effect that has been seen in more than a couple of studies, which actually showed that the level of anxiety in the third generation is higher. In the difference between the level of anxiety in the third generation and their peers, the difference is bigger than the difference was between the second generation and our peers. And the question is, why is that? Why is it increasing? And I think one very reasonable answer to that might be that the third generation does have a different sense of personal sensitivity to what can happen, the bad things that can happen. And so that they have more than their peers. And like their peers, they actually live in a world or grow up in a world that's very different from the world that the second generation grew up in. We grew up basically between the 50s and the 70s. The world was very different than the world between, the 80s and the 2000s. So the same kind of, they have, the third generation has a little bit more tendency towards anxiety and interacting with the world in which they live in. They are more anxious than their peers, and the difference is actually greater than the difference that was between us and our peers. But there is dilution, as I said, in terms of so-called intermarriage.
Oh, okay. That's great.
So I'm Rabbi Michael Howell from Temple Israel Reform Congregation of Staten Island, and it's my honor to present tonight this Holocaust Kaddish with one of our members, Michelle Lee. Yit Gadol.
Auschwitz.
Bia Kadash.
Lodz.
Shemei Rabbah.
Bonar.
Bialma Divarach Hirute.
Babi Yar.
Biamlik Malchute.
Baidanek.
Bechayechon Uvyomechon.
Birkenau.
Uchaye de Chol Beit Yisrael.
Kovno.
Ba'agala Vizman Kariv.
Janowska.
V'imeru. Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabba Mevarach Le'olam Almei Almaya. Yit Barak V'yishtabach.
Theresienstadt.
V'yit Pa'ar V'yit Roman.
Buchenwald.
V'yit Naseh V'yit Hadar.
Treblinka.
V'yit Alev V'yit Balal.
Vilna.
Shmei Kudishah Berichu.
Bergen-Belsen.
Eila.
Mauthausen.
In Kol Birchata V'Shirata.
Dachau.
Tush Bechata V'Nechamata.
Minsk.
Damiran Bialma.
Warsaw.
V'imeru. Amen. Yehi Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya V'Chaim Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael. V'imeru. Amen. Osei Shalom B'Romav. Huya Osei Shalom. Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael. V'imeru. Amen.
El Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamomi, Ametzei Menucha Nechona, Ale Kanefei Hashchina. B'malo kedoshim utehorim kezorakia mazir. Et Nishema HaKedoshim Ve'Ate'alim She'ometu V'Shene'adu V'Shenishchatu V'Shenishrefu V'Shenitbe'o V'Shenechneku Ale Kiddush Hashem. על ידי הצוררים הגרמנים, יימח שמם וזכרם, בעבור סמלי נדר נותן צדקה ביד אזכרת נשמותיהם. בגן לכן בעלי הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפם לעולמים ויצור ביצור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם וינוחו בשלום על מזכרותיהם
Good evening. On the eve of the election of 2016, I participated in the 24-hour reading of the 4 Christian Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, at St. John's Episcopal Church in Rosebank. I was assigned to read from 4 a.m. to 5 a.m. the Gospel of John, aloud to an empty church. It was a gospel that I had not read since graduating seminary in 1981. I hadn't read it since then because we were taught in seminary that it was a very significantly anti-Judaic text and that it was best not to read it publicly so as not to affirm the anti-Judaic nature of much of what John writes. When I read it that night, on the eve of that election, I was horrified. And I realized in that empty sanctuary the privilege of being a Gentile. I could ignore those texts. I could not preach on them or speak to them. But it never dawned on me after 30 years of ordained ministry that other people read those texts without me and were influenced by the anti-Semitism and the anti-Judaic nature of much of what John said and wrote. Tonight, there is little to say and much to do on the part of Gentile Christians if we are serious in ending anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism in the world. We are cast as Gentiles who are privileged with the burden of repentance for the ways the church has used its privilege as an agent of the state or as an agent of an ideology used by the state, couched in God language that has been used to dehumanize the Jewish people and to desensitize the Gentile world to the damage and wounds and ultimate murder of people as a result of anti-Jewish Christian ideology. We must dismantle the theology, the teaching, and the practice that is rooted in and perpetuates anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. This includes biblical and extra-biblical theologies, words, ideas, images, and stories that dehumanize and devalue Jewish lives. And Gentiles, we must commit ourselves to repudiate these anti-Semitic Christian cultural practices in order to make a Gentile dominant world safe and life protecting for all Jews. This includes the public repentance of the lies upon lies perpetuated by anti-Jewish Christian theology and practice that made the Holocaust possible and continues as a threat to Jewish lives today, here in the United States and throughout the world. Such repentance must be a repentance that acknowledges the evil and sin of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. It must be public and it must be rooted in action. And it is a repentance that must happen again and again. Such a repentance in action begins by working in solidarity, shoulder to shoulder, shutting our mouths and creating a common space that is Jewish safe, Jewish welcoming, and life affirming. By teaching in our pulpits and in our classrooms, in all of our catechism, the sin of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, and removing all references in prayer and in teaching that reinforce anti-Judaism that emanates from our sermons, our catechisms, and even our actions. All that we teach and live about God that dehumanizes the lives of Jews must be removed, must be changed, must be condemned, must be repudiated, must be repented, must be acknowledged again and again and again. It is a task that is unending. It's the deepest form of prejudice. It has cost the loss of millions of lives. And it must happen in order for us to be true to who we are as humans, who acknowledge the same authority of one God, for whom all life is precious. Those, I hope, are little words that will lead to much action. Thank you for your invitation this evening.
And thank you, Terry, for closing out with such beautiful sentiment of interfaith alliances and activism. I want to acknowledge in particular the survivors who are here. Arthur Spielman, I see, I'm sure there may be others, 2Gs and 3Gs. And the motto of the Wagner College Holocaust Center is to inspire courage. And Dr. Felsen's words this evening, pointing to post-traumatic resilience as well as challenges. The words of Imam Tahir, the words of our co-chairs, Manny and Shannon Sachs, and of Reverend Terry Troia, all of these are calls to action for all of us, to take the courage to be to not be bystanders, to be upstanders, to look around us, to think harder about the injustices we may not see, as well as those we do see, and to do more, to pledge to make sure that hate does not grow in this country or in this borough and in this moment, and that all of us must do what we can to make sure that that does not happen. So thank you so much to all of you for coming tonight. If any of you would like to further support the programs of the Wagner College Holocaust Center, you can email us at holocaust.center@wagner.edu. You can Google us and to offer more support for our work. And to everyone who helped tonight, thank you so much, but especially Dr. Felsen. Really, this has been a topic that several of the 2Gs on my advisory committee have been asking to cover this topic for a long time. And I know even my students from different backgrounds have asked about intergenerational trauma. And I know that we'll be thinking a lot about that photo you showed and your remarks for a long time. So thank you so much. And to everybody, have a good night. And please hold International Holocaust Remembrance Day in your heart. Our next program is on February 24th on Friedel Dicker Brandeis and the Children's Art of the Terrorism Ghetto and their teacher. And we have a program on March 1st on Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish, and a program with Dan and his grandmother, a student film on Romanian Romania and the Holocaust on April 14th. Stay tuned, and if you need more information, just reach out holocaust.center@wagner.edu.